Hey everyone, this is Derrick Crowe, and you are watching the first episode of Rise Like Lions, a new video and podcast series that I'm working on to talk about how we build a country that works for everybody, not just corporations and the rich. If it sounds like I'm a democratic socialist, that's because I am. I'm also a Justice Democrat and a recent congressional candidate here in the state of Texas. I didn't win my primary, but what we're hoping to do is to continue to build on the momentum that we put together fighting for progressive policies and for an alternative vision to this idea that's being put forward out there that the only way to organize our society is through out of control capitalism. A little bit about myself. I grew up in a small town. I have worked on Capitol Hill for Democrats all across the political spectrum, and have found over the last few years myself increasingly concerned that the party that I put so much energy into is tipping further and further towards what Thomas Piketty has recently identified as the Brahmin Left, which essentially is super high income liberal folks who tend to be white as the main interest group that the party's interests are serving, instead of being a party that fights vociferously for the working class and for our groups that are not as privileged in our society as white liberals, who are increasingly being the only group that seems to be served by policies coming out of Washington. There's been a couple of great articles that I wanted to talk about as the way of kicking off the first episode here. The first is actually in the New York Times today. Thomas Edsall has written a great piece called "The Democrats' Gentrification Problem." And I should preface all of this by saying that you're going to hear me criticize my own political movements quite a bit as I talk about this stuff, because I care about them and I want to offer some constructive criticism where I see that it's needed. And you should just always take as kind of a given that I kind of view the modern Republican Party as a bunch of goblins that are serving essentially the interests of Wall Street and corporations, and they've allowed their party to be captured by some of the ugliest elements in American politics. So just take that as a given. I think we can't elect these Republicans, but I also think that it means that primaries matter quite a bit in the Democratic Party, like the one I just went through here, and that we have an obligation to send not just any Democrat to Washington, but real working class oriented folks who have an eye for policy, for breaking up big unaccountable institutions like big banks and out of control corporations and monopolies, and putting democracy back not only at the ballot box, but also in our daily life, in our workplace, and in our economy. And that's why I've been really attracted to the orientation of democratic socialism lately, first through the Bernie Sanders movement, but also just generally through what I've seen here locally in Austin. Because if you're looking for the folks who were pivotal in fighting for things like paid sick leave ordinances at City Hall, all the way up to federal policies, then what we're seeing on the Democratic Socialist side is the kind that's really exciting to me. But back to this article that's in the New York Times today. Edsall's piece writes about the dynamics that we're seeing in the major metropolitan areas, where you're seeing a lot of very well-to-do white liberal families moving back into city cores that had traditionally been, up to this point for the last several decades, minority strongholds in cities. And the folks who are moving in have higher incomes, and they're forcing people out through rising property values and housing prices. And you're seeing the city's essentially inhaling white upper-class liberal families and exhaling lower income Hispanic and Black and other minority communities. And you're seeing that here in the city where I live, in Austin, Texas. You're seeing a gentrification wave that is really ratcheting up tensions here inside the city. We have, just to get really specific for a second, on the Riverside, in the East Riverside neighborhood, there is a project happening called Project Catalyst. It is paired with the Oracle campus that's being installed here. So we have a tech campus being built and completed, and there's this accompanying housing project that's going to be constructed. And it's built right in the middle of lower income housing. And it's going to push folks further to the east in town to make room for these new tech workers. And it's ratcheting up tensions here. And those folks that will move into that new development are the folks that Thomas Piketty has identified as the Brahmin Left. And they are folks who have higher incomes, who think of themselves as committed to racial justice, but all across the country in places like California are fighting against efforts to match public housing needs to the places where these new developments are happening. And so you're seeing folks who are talking a good talk about racial justice, but who are really participating in not in my NIMBYism, not in my backyardism in their local areas, because they want justice everywhere where it doesn't implicate them. And that's a real problem here in our community. It's a problem nationally. It's a problem within our party. And I think what you're seeing at the local level that's pointed out in this article when it comes to housing prices and housing injustice and the bifurcation of who in the traditional progressive and liberal coalition can afford to live in the places that have the new economic opportunity, and how those groups view themselves and how they got to where they are, is really the driver of the split that you're seeing in the Democratic Party right now. People like to talk about how we keep rehashing 2016 in the current primary cycles. And in some instances, that's correct. But the reason for it is not driven by the personalities of Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. The reason for it is there are these two quintessential different experiences now within the Democratic Party. On one side, you have the folks who are in these lower income communities, who are in minority communities and minority groups, who are finding themselves being displaced by housing prices and cost of living increases in places where they've lived for generations, and they're being pushed out, and they're seeing their neighborhoods transformed around them and not being open to allowing them to share in that opportunity. And, in some instances, like here in Austin, you're seeing properties getting bought up and housing prices going up and property values increasing and property taxes increasing because people are doing things like buying up properties to put in Airbnbs, not to actually live there. And that's exacerbating this feeling of being locked out of the prosperity that is going on around them. And it's pushing them not just out of party movements, but physically out of the spaces where they've been occupying. On the other side, you have generally white liberal folks who are well-educated and are upper income folks who have always thought of themselves as liberals. And when they move into these areas, they like the amenities and they want to maximize the spaces that they're buying in. They're higher income coming in than the people that are being pushed out. And they have grown up under this Bill Clinton, this new Democrat ideology of meritocracy. And it makes them feel very good to think that they've worked very hard, and these new trappings of affluence are the results of the labor that they've put into it. And so they don't want to hear about the need for economic justice right in their backyard. And they don't support redistribution as far as a policy agenda goes. And so you're seeing these two very different, in large part racially driven experiences within the Democratic Party. But those experiences that are affecting minority communities specifically, also by extension, are affecting the white working class. And so you've got groups of people who are having these totally different economic experiences in ostensibly the same progressive, liberal, Democratic coalition, and they're talking past each other because their life experiences are so different. The problem is because party structures are set up in our current campaign finance environment to follow the money, that the Democratic Party seems to be following the path of least resistance and is catering more and more to this Brahmin Left faction and is giving up opportunities to bring people back into the political fold that created the Obama winning coalition, but also the folks who still weren't served even by that coalition. And if we continue to do that, we are absolutely going to have a hard time responding effectively to the increasingly nativist right-wing populism that is really a nativism and a xenophobia and a nationalism in the most toxic meaning of all of those words. If you take a coalition that is composed of those two different experiences, and then you hit it with a bat that is nativist right-wing populism, it can shatter because it's very brittle if our policy platform doesn't move to address the demand that's out there among our base for redistribution. And I just want to talk about that in the context of another article, another report that's come out recently by Justice Democrats. Now, full disclosure, I am a Justice Democrat. I ran a congressional race as a Justice Democrat. And I believe very strongly that they are one of the most useful political forces out there on the progressive side trying to fix this problem. And I can't, from the experience as a candidate, I can't tell you enough how helpful they are to candidates like me who want to fight for these kind of policies. But, they just put out a report, and I'm bringing something up, so I apologize for looking away from the camera for a second. They put out a report recently called The Future of the Party. And that report talked about the difference between the policies that are being supported by members of Congress in these Democratic districts and what the base wants. And the picture that emerges is that we have a lot of Brahmin Left political representatives representing Democratic base districts. And so they created, in the course of this report, a kind of model Democrat for each of these districts that reflects the basic average Democrat that actually exists in these democratically controlled congressional districts, and compared it to the actual votes that the member of Congress there that's a Democrat is voting. And here's what they said. They said, if every member who currently does not support Medicare for all, but who the model predicts would support it, were replaced, support for Medicare for all among the Democratic caucus would go from 63% to 78%. If you did that for the $15 an hour minimum wage, that support would go from 87% inside the Democratic caucus to 97% inside the House Democratic caucus. If you did it for a millionaire's tax, you would go from having a very low level of support among House Democrats to having about half of the House Democrats support a millionaire's tax. Now, what that shows you is, among other things that are really amazing in this report that I would really recommend you check out, it's thefutureoftheparty.com or futureoftheparty.org. You'll find that there is a broad support for very progressive, even democratic socialist policies among the Democratic base. The problem is they are not being served by candidates who are pushing for those things and are instead being represented by people that are catering to the folks that are being served in this new economy and who are these white liberal Democrats who are moving into these metropolitan areas and pushing out the folks that are feeling left behind more and more by the party. And that has we saw that in the race that I ran, and I'll try not to make this channel into, score settling or sour grapes airing from my previous primary, but I think there's some helpful examples in the dynamic we're talking about. At one of our first debates in the primary I was in, one of my primary opponents, after I gave a strong defense of a $15 an hour minimum wage, got up and argued that we don't need to worry about raising the minimum wage because that's just going to cause automation to get rid of jobs, and that the real solution was education. Now, right there, you had this ideology from myself that I would call solidarity with the working class through raising the minimum wage, bumping up against this meritocracy idea that all we have to do is make sure everybody has equal access to education, and these problems and inequalities would just work themselves out. The problem is that there are reports out this week that show that Brahmin Left ideology is actually not true. Derek Hamilton and a number of other great researchers who have looked at the disparities among African Americans and the racial wealth divide have concluded this week that the structures of inequality in our society among racial demographics, especially between white folks and African American folks, is inherently created, held up, and supported by white supremacy and racist systemic features of our economy and our politics, and that there is literally nothing that an African American can do individually that will overcome the disadvantages that they face in this system, absent strong redistribution policies. Because when you look at the number of families who are white who are millionaires versus the number of African Americans who are black and who are millionaires, the disparities are almost entirely explained by race. And even if you educate as a member of the African American community, if you educate yourself, your outcomes will still be far, far behind the outcomes for a similarly educated or even less educated white person in our society on average. And so we run this risk of allowing our coalition on the Democratic and on the left side to become so brittle because we're not willing, as the folks with the cheat codes inside the party, the white folks, to acquiesce to economic justice measures in our neighborhoods and in our cities. And so I'm going to be out there using this channel and any other media I can create to fight for a country that works for everybody, not just corporations and the rich and the high income earners. And we're going to be talking about the need for things, not just college for all and student debt forgiveness, which we need, but also raising minimum wages, forgiving actual student debt, wealth redistribution measures that could get at some of these intractable problems, and fighting back against this idea that there's just no alternative to out of control capitalism. So I hope that's something that speaks to you, and I hope that you'll support this channel. We're going to be funding it through a Patreon link. You can go to patreon.com/Derrick Crowe. That's DerrickCrowe, and sign up to become a regular supporter. Even if it's just a couple of dollars, it'll unlock exclusive content that we'll be producing from now on. But it also allows us to continually up the production quality and to boost posts and things like that to get people on the channel and getting this message out. So I really appreciate your attention. I hope it was interesting. Please make sure you subscribe, that you like, and that you share the content that you find here.